Welcome to the My House Podcast, a show about the past, present, and future goings-on at the My House Youth Drop-In Center in Wasilla, Alaska, with your host, Michelle Overstreet.
Hi, welcome to the My House Podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Overstreet, and today I am joined by Rachael Ridge and Will Carson. I'm so excited to be here with these two people. Will is from 64 North, an architecture company out of Los Angeles, and Rachael Ridge is a project manager who works locally. Before we get into our discussion today, let's cut to Isaac. Do you have any housekeeping for us?
Really quick. We're Merry post-Christmas to everyone because this is coming out after Christmas, although for us it's still before Christmas. So hope everyone's Christmas was wonderful, I'm sure. Going forward, we're probably going to have a few cuts to what is releasing just because I will not be in the state for a couple of weeks, but there'll still be some shows that are dropping through the first couple weeks of January. Plenty of Diag Nonsense stuff, plenty of My House podcast stuff, and really that's it. It's another year coming up, and I'm super excited for that. And January is kind of ASHTA's month and the human and sex trafficking month. So I believe we do have some events and some days that are planned for that, right, Michelle?
We do. Well, those will be coming up with Stacy in the next week or so.
Yep. So just be tuned to the Facebook and the social media for more information on those.
Cool. Thanks, Isaac. I'm so excited to have Will and Rachael here today. Will designed a building or helped design a building in 2015 that won a Time Magazine Invention of the Year award for a building on Skid Row in LA that is designed to have retail shops on the main floor, office space on the second floor, and then different kinds of housing upstairs for homeless people to live in. And so I've had a picture of that building on my wall since 2015. That was kind of my dream board. And Will, you grew up here. Yep. Your parents were both school teachers here, graduated Colony High School, and then went to Harvard. And you work with world-renowned architect Frank Gehry.
I didn't actually. He's my intellectual grandfather, let's say. So okay. I worked for someone who worked for him.
Very good.
Yes. Hiroshi, who is one of our senior staff, did work with Frank for quite some time.
It's very exciting. You can see this influence in a lot of your work. What I love about it is that it's unique and it's simple but complex. And I'm so excited that you're the architect of record for our $23 million appropriation project.
What's the name of that building, Rachael?
The Carson-Cottle Center.
Just because we had talked about it 2 episodes ago. Will's dad is also famed My House podcast guest, Michael Carson, only 2 more times on the podcast, and then he gets the gold jacket or whatever. He's been on 3 times for opioid task force stuff and board stuff and My House stuff. So
yeah, he's a co-founder in terms of My House. He's been with us from the very, very beginning. The really cool thing for me is that this is such a landmark project that will really, what we've been asking for at My House for the last 14 years is a paradigm shift in the way that we treat homeless youth, that instead of treating them like a liability, they're treated like an asset. They're included in community conversations and discussions, and they work and are productive at the level that they can be productive, but are honored members of our community. And I think too often they're put into a building or into a program where they're not integrated into the community and they feel isolated, and it changes their perception of how they fit in and what their place is. And what I love about this building is that it gives them a chance to live upstairs and come downstairs to go to work in the building. They're still in an internship. They'll come over here because this building will stay our primary case management job training center. And just tell me some of your thoughts on what we've been doing. We spent the morning kind of talking about building design. And
before we go there, I wanted to say that I think what you just said really makes a lot of sense with how we've always approached buildings. You know, one of the things that we do is we do buildings for formerly homeless folks or for folks that are low income or what have you. And we get asked the question like, oh, how do you approach the design of a project for formerly homeless? And it's kind of a head scratcher because for us, it's a weird question to be asked because we don't approach that building any differently than we approach developing any other project that we do. And whether that's a house for a wealthy person or a museum or a restaurant or whatever it is.
Which you have experience in all those. I've seen the
Yes.
pictures and they're so much fun.
Well, and I think, one of the luxuries of what we get to do is that we get to live vicariously in other people's shoes by getting to be involved in their projects. And we get to then learn things from each of those and then bring them to the next project that we get to work on. But I do think what you said about, not siloing is definitely one of the things that we try to do, not only in thinking about the kind of work that we do for formerly homeless or what have you, but also even within a building, because, I think that creating those connections is what makes building interesting and full of life, and it's what makes life meaningful in some way. And, if the building can facilitate those things, then so much the better.
Love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
And I think we're, the next day or two here and earlier today, we're learning a lot about the program, and we're interviewing all the stakeholders and really taking it from a pretty basic understanding. Will's new to my house a little bit. I'm new to my house a little bit. And we're learning what programs are offered and what services and the reasons behind that. And interviewing each of the stakeholders and understanding the methodology that goes behind these programs, that allows us to get the floor plan dialed in so that we make the most effective use of the space. We've got some services that can overlap, some spaces that can overlap, and we learn about that and figure that out through these interviews. And I think the big takeaway I've had in the last 24 hours of these intense meetings is this building is the next step. So my house, where we're sitting here today, it's going to continue to provide its same functions. It's a familiar place where the folks can come. They've been here, they've helped here, they've worked here, they're proud to be here, and it creates their family entity here. This is where they get their support. And Michelle kind of had a good analogy where you walk in the door and you've got the cafe and the retail shop, and then the case managers are in the back or in the little further on. And so you walk into a welcoming space where if you're not ready to approach the case managers quite yet, there's a spot for you. You can have a seat. You can wait a minute. And not everybody's going to come waltzing in the door. Hey, I'm here for some help. They need a minute. And understanding that after visiting with the folks here and with Michelle and the other program managers here, it's brought that understanding to light. And I understand now why this is staying here, and the new center is all about what's your next step. So this is kind of the sorting grounds. You get established here, and then you go to the new building, which is the next step. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. It's so exciting to hear your commentary and the feedback. I really did want, and with appropriations money, this really building should belong to all of us. It should belong to the whole community. It should be something that we should all be proud of and that we can all go into and enjoy. And I really feel like that's the direction we're moving in. I think the community is going to really feel proud of this. I think we have enough stakeholders engaged that it's going to be fun to be able to see that vision come together as a group instead of just, my God, could you imagine if the three of us had to make all of these decisions or think all of this up? And instead, we've had meetings with 3 different people this morning that sort of brought their ideas, and one had a PowerPoint with pictures and was really detailed. And
yeah, it's all coming together now. I mean, we're getting all the ideas on the paper.
It's so exciting.
Will's doing the program. He's got this cool, I call it a bubble map. What did you call it? Bubble diagram?
Bubble diagram,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what made you get started in homeless housing, and how did you end up where you are?
Well, I think I've told you both, this story, but so growing up here in the Valley, my dad was involved in and active in helping homeless youth. So he was volunteering for Covenant House on weekends and would kind of come back and say, oh, this last weekend we got to do this, and we walked around the Diamond Center Mall all night, and we met with these kids, and then we got, and then later when I was in high school, when sometimes when kids or even classmates of mine would not have a home for a night or 2 nights or whatever it was, sometimes they'd come and stay with us. And, I found that education as part of my high school education really useful. In some ways, probably more useful than the other parts of the high school education. And just, being able to make like a human relationship with another person who had a different experience than I did, but still an interesting person who had, interesting life. And we had certain things we had in common, certain things we could learn from each other. And so, I didn't really think about that. I just that happened, put it in my pocket, went on. And then I went on to Harvard, studied at Harvard, did a kind of pan-disciplinary design degree there, and then actually worked as a documentary filmmaker and then as a creative director in Silicon Valley, doing just different kinds of creative stuff, let's say. At the end of the first dot-com boom, kind of thought, a lot of this is kind of glorified advertising or just advertising, and thought, there was that architecture thing, And so I had this naive idea that I was going to make a positive difference in the world by being an architect. And I like to say that, 20 some odd years later, I still have that naive idea that I'm making a positive difference in the world of being an architect.
And you are.
And so I went and got my graduate degree at UCLA and studied overseas at the Ungewandten in Vienna with a woman named Zaha Hadid, who makes super cool Sorvy buildings. She's since passed away, but super amazing architect and woman. And then after graduating, started working for a gentleman named Michael Maltzin, who was a designer at Frank Gehry's office and had designed the Walt Disney Concert Hall and had then started his own practice. And he had started to interact, it was like 2005, with an older architect who was doing housing and supportive housing or affordable housing, these kinds of pieces. And, if we look at like the trajectory of architecture in the 1900s, there's a big piece of architecture that provides, what was typically called social housing in Europe. And you can look at important architects like Le Corbusier or whoever. And this is a big part of, we look at modernism and, architecture in general and its trajectory over that, century, figuring out how to house people in ways that make sense and is wonderful and is thoughtful, but also supportive is part of the trajectory of architecture. And so I think it was a natural thing for Michael and his office to get involved in that. And so I showed up, I think the first day of my internship, and they had this new project, which was the Rainbow Apartments, which was for Skid Row Housing Trust. And I had a bunch of blocks of MDF, and they were like, okay, make some different shapes that could be this building. And then over the course of the next decade, I was able to work on a number of these projects, including the one that you mentioned, Michelle, which was Star Apartments, which are 100% affordable, permanent supportive housing for homeless folks. And it was great because we could see them be realized. We could go back year after year and meet people that were these are, when you move into these, you can stay there forever. There's case managers on the ground floor, so there's supportive services built into the building. You're not just providing housing, you're actually helping people with, the next steps in their lives. And, Skid Row in LA is a pretty rough place. And, taking those folks out of that context and giving them some, new opportunities. And so we've now, I've had 64 North is our firm, and we've been doing this now for, 2015-ish. And we are now doing similar work. So earlier this month, we broke ground on a 94-unit, $37 million, 100% affordable housing building in what's called Westlake outside of downtown Los Angeles. And it's half of it is for formerly homeless and half of it is for families, and they're 2 and 3 and bedrooms. And we're doing another project in Palm Springs that's a similar thing for seniors, and another one right next door in Westlake in Los Angeles that's for seniors and for formerly homeless, and so on and so forth. So it's great work to be involved in. It's obviously really, like my house, it's very easy to be excited about and inspired to contribute to and appreciate being able to contribute to. And I think that's work that we're excited to be involved in.
Awesome. I love that you got to come back to Alaska and do a project here with your expertise and knowledge. It just feels like 64 North is the latitude of Nome,
Yep.
where you were born. And it just feels like a little bit of a full circle. Not quite totally full circle because it's not Nome, but I really hope that this building concept catches on, because it doesn't have to be a $23 million building. We could do these small...
Well, you have been doing them.
Well,
We have
Nome
been
is
doing
in
them.
critical need of affordable housing if you looked out there. So
Yeah. And so it's something that could be duplicated on a smaller scale all across Alaska and all across the country, really to effectively serve homeless with an exit strategy. I think for a number of years while I was building the My House project, the housing first model was really the kind of the go-to. And I was in Isaac might have been in this meeting with me. We were in a strategic planning meeting where a consultant drew a circle on the board and wrote housing in the middle of it and said, well, what else do you want for your strategic plan? And I said, an exit plan. And he said, what is that? And I said, an exit out of homelessness, that people don't just get housing, they get an exit so that they can move on in their lives and do awesome things and someday buy their own home. And it was like I was speaking Swahili. It was completely, we had to spend like 15 minutes kind of walking through that. And even when it was done, the consultants who were working on that strategic plan did not understand what I was talking about in real life. We've spent a year kind of trying to...
You've spent longer. I've spent a year.
Yeah, Isaac spent a year with me on this project, just trying to explain to them that we need to have exits, that even if people are pursuing a DVR, a Division of Voc Rehab pathway due to developmental delays or disabilities, they still need to be able to see themselves as an active, contributing community member, that we don't just put them in housing and say, have a nice life. And so I really love the way this building models that. It becomes an intrinsic piece of construction even.
Yeah, and we've put in just some of the conversations today talking about, and on the podcast with Rachael on it from a couple episodes ago, we talked a lot about the permanent supported housing and the human and sex trafficking, preventative housing. What I want to ask you, Will, and if you've been in and around the My House building, you've definitely seen the rendering at this point from would have been coming up on about a year old at this point. We've just had it out in the front area, and maybe if I'm feeling good at my job when this releases, then I'll find a way to get that picture out in the podcast logo or something like that for this episode, so that if you haven't seen it, you can take a look at it. But I've heard a little bit about the design philosophy for the look of the building, and obviously, especially after having these conversations, maybe the final look is a little bit different, but it's a very, very striking looking building. There's a lot of angles in there. It's stark white in the picture, so it almost this time of year it would just blend right in with the landscape. What was your design philosophy around just how the building looks from an artistic standpoint?
Well, I think buildings have to do a lot of different things. They're a real synthesis. So they're putting together, any building's putting together functional requirements and aesthetic requirements and programmatic requirements and economic, all these different pieces. And so I think the design of the building in terms of how it looks is also doing those on many levels. And so we did a little PowerPoint sketch thing, which I think kind of tells the story, but says like, okay, ideally at some level, if we could, this building's maybe a shed or a garage, but at some level,
it really is.
If we started with a simple typology that everybody knows, we'd start with a house. But, taking a 40,000 square foot house and blowing it up like the Incredible Hulk, that would be a pretty strange building. And so, and also just from Rachael talked a little bit a minute ago about, the kind of accessibility of the space that you walk in, you feel at home. Well, if you walk into a monster object,
you'll feel like a giant's doll or something.
Yeah, and or like the Death Star is not very welcoming, and so we want to. So instead, could it be a series of houses that are all put together, and then but it's probably not a one-story building. In fact, we're fairly certain that it's not because it'll take up the entire site, and we won't have any landscape left. So then we just take that and we make it a little taller. And how tall, we're not exactly sure yet, but it does look nicer the taller it is. And then, I think that, and then the other piece of that was, growing up here, driving down the West Fishhook every day on the way to school, driving by A-frames, being up in Independence and seeing A-frames, that's a kind of classic typology. So is the A-frame part of that as much as a house? Also, like just full disclosure, there's, contemporary architecture where you can look at early Frank buildings or whatever that, have this kind of logic of multiple pieces and parts and how they're shaped. And then, so we developed the project kind of thinking about all of those things. And then, you have practical things like you need windows and you want those windows to go a certain direction. And when it's the big front door, you want a big amount of glass. And when it needs to be private or you have less money, you put less windows and things like that.
Or when it, snows 4 feet in a week like it did this past week.
Exactly. So we're balancing those. And then with the exterior of the building, I think we find things like white compelling or maybe slightly gray so they don't get dirty quite as fast. But because they can take on the color of a lot of things, when the sun sets on the building, it turns pink. And when it's late at night, it's blue. And, we work a lot in 3 dimensions. And we work with 3-dimensional software like somebody would work when they're being an animator. And so that software allows us to actually put real light from different times of day on our 3-dimensional objects to see how it looks. And it's pretty interesting and compelling to see how that happens. And then, also I think maybe this is part of, there's probably some relationship to Valley architecture and there's some relationship to, I don't know, Frank Gehry, but, things like corrugated metal or other very practical cladding can be used, but be used in ways that's interesting and thoughtful and beautiful. And it doesn't have to be like made out of golden marble to be an important building. And then obviously this building will hopefully have an incredibly long life. So we want it to last a long time. So we had to build other things that are lasting. So all those things went into that. And then the funny thing was, of course, when we finished and we showed it to, I don't remember who, not someone in my house, but somebody else, probably in LA, they said, oh yeah, it looks just like the mountains there. And we said, oh, snap, it does. And so that was a complete accident, but okay, we'll take it. So
It's beautiful. And the youth, we did a little round table with the youth advisory board and said, what do you want it to look like? And I remember ultimately what came out of that was they wanted it to represent community, a village, a group of homes, something friendly. And a lot of the comments that we had when we first got the rendering was, oh, it looks like a Christmas village. We like that. That represents what we, the spirit.
Well, and I hope that like a good building it's not one-to-one. It's not like, oh, look, it's a wave. That's a kind of, I think, a very simplistic thing that I think buildings can do more than that. But I think at the same time, it can take on multiple meanings, and it can mean different things for different people in terms of how they want and need it to be and mean for them. And I think day to day, one architectural theorist that I appreciate, Jeff Kipnis, talks about, buildings as soundtrack because we're not aware of the buildings that we're in every day. We're just in them. But if you have your AirPods in and you've got a really great soundtrack to whatever it is that you're doing, it really changes your day, whether you're on the subway or whatever you're doing. And so I think similarly, like the building can hopefully be a good kind of basis or launching pad or foundation or whatever we want to think about to enable all of those things. And then, to make people feel like, yes, this is for the community, but also this is for the folks who would come to my house as clients. And this is their building, the same way this building is their building, and that there's pride of ownership, and that not just somebody, many somebodies care about them enough and have worked hard enough to make that, part of their lives.
Yeah. I love that lift up.
And I think, taking a 40,000 square foot building and making it scalable to the human scale, we sat and looked at a bunch of pictures yesterday, and Will is an expert at doing that. And so it'll be fun to see. It'll be a challenge, and I think you'll enjoy the fun in coming up with that.
Yeah, I think the human scale is really important. I think that language gets used a lot in ways that sometimes isn't exactly right, but I think it's super important because, nobody feels at home when they go to the airport. And, and there's, so like, how do we make a space that is 40,000 square feet, but that there really are specific places to be and belong and in those ways. So,
and we just had a good conversation with the leader of the Redemption program, and making those residential units not institutional and making them feel more of a home, but yet you're in a large commercial building.
Yeah, and you're safe. Mm-hmm. We've
talked a lot about security.
Mm-hmm. The safety of, for particularly, I think you met a young man right before we came in here who is from Mountain Village. And it's a tiny, tiny town of maybe 300, 400 people. And so having someone like that who goes to reside in the permanent supported housing there, having it feel like home to him. What does that look like? What does that mean? How do we create a space that he feels proud to go into, but also comfortable? And that can be, I can see that there are going to be places where we're challenged, but I think this team, we're really putting together some neat ideas, and I think this team is really taking the information and sort of applying it in a way that building is going to represent something different for everybody. And that was one of the things about the rendering that was cool. There were people that looked at the rendering and said, oh, it's so contemporary. And there were people that looked at it and said, oh, it looks like a Christmas village. And other people looked at it and said, oh, that symbolizes community. And so it really spoke to different people in different ways. And I really enjoyed that part of the concept.
Yeah, like any good art. And I feel like we could easily talk for another hour, but all three of you have to talk to people that are coming in right now because we're doing this right in the middle of the meetings. So I know that I have a lot of architects' names that I have to look up now while I'm editing this podcast. And thank you, Rachael, for coming back on, and Will for taking the time out of a very busy schedule over today and tomorrow to do this with us.
Yeah, Will is like an encyclopedia of architects and reference. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us and for taking time out to do this. As Isaac said, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you both for being here. The My House podcast is recorded at the My House studio in Wasilla, Alaska. Our producer and editor is Isaac Smolden, and I'm Michelle Overstreet. Until next time.